welcome to this conversation about race, power, and privilege in conservation. Whenever I've had this conversation, and I'm so glad to have had it over the last 2 years now, I always start with the question, is it possible to have a productive conversation on race, power, and privilege in conservation, fully acknowledging but pushing through the discomfort these topics elicit? I think the answer to that is yes. But I have to also ask, why do these topics elicit such discomfort? And I lean very much on Brené Brown, who I absolutely love and I'm guided by. And she says that at the base of every human emotion is the desire to belong and the desire for connection. So when you start talking about race, it brings us feelings of oppression and inequality on one side and privilege and shame on the other. And shame is the most powerful because it tells you that you don't belong and that you don't deserve to belong. So as soon as you hear this topic, your knee-jerk reaction is to shut down because you've already felt judged by the color of your skin. I am white and therefore I am wrong. I am Black and I've been through too much. I'm brown and no one even cares what I think. I cannot engage. So my hope today is that we will disengage from shame and separate ourselves from our actions. We can put the actions in the middle of the room and examine them. They are actions, they can be changed. So as long as we have the courage to speak out and make mistakes and ask for help and a different way forward, we can leave here knowing that we belong. I have to say that I am not an expert in this topic. I'm someone who reads quite a lot about it, and I've started being trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I feel that the more that we talk about this topic, the more interested and invested I am, because I know what power it has had over so many people's lives and over the agenda of conservation as we know it. But if we talk about this with empathy and courage, the better that we will be at this thing called conservation. So I want this, if possible, for it to be a safe space for everybody to express their opinions once I let you out up on stage. And I do this with another caveat, which is that historically we've discussed this issue with such anger and finger pointing and in such a vitriolic fashion. And I always try to have a healthier discussion. And the best way to do it is to recognize that everybody in this room is on a different part of the continuum, the journey to better understand these issues. So empathy and courage, those are the keywords. Those are the keywords. Right, so I can't cover every single one of these topics comprehensively. Race is huge, power is huge, privilege is giant. But I will cover parts of each, all right, as much as I can. So this is a map by a gentleman called Henry R.W. Hingston. And he wrote a paper in 1931, a lot of things that happened before then. And he said that because of relentless hunting and trade and agriculture, the separation of people from wildlife was imperative. And he proposed then the creation of these national parks that you can see across East Africa. He actually proposed 10 mega parks across the continent. And those parks, very many of them still exist in one shape or form today. And that was the beginning of the colonial project, which is nature. I start with that. I also start with the fact that I attended a Twitter space a few days ago, and there was a gentleman called Jeremy Williams, who is an expert in this topic. And he had a quote that really struck me, which is that the past is a project of the present to shape the future. The past matters, and we really have to learn from it. So when I look at that map and when I think of R.W. Hingston and the plans that he had, I have to hold these two things in tension. One is a relic of a very painful time where, and these were his actual words, Europeans will be compensated and Africans will be resettled. And so this was the beginning of our national parks movement. So I hold on one side the darkness and the tension of that. And then on the other side, the fact that for many of us who've had the privilege to go to these national parks today, it has shaped so much of what we believe is important in terms of wildlife and wild spaces. These are some of the things that really I continue to hold. The past really matters. And Indigenous people in the present are about 5% of the world population, and yet they hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. So I think it's quite funny that as somebody almost 100 years ago is talking about the imperative separation of Africans from their nature, we still have, and up until today, Indigenous people who are doing the service of making sure that our biodiversity is intact and growing through their cultures. But we still rarely hear their voices. And I think that is one of the saddest things today, that that quote from about the Indigenous people came from National Geographic. And yet you see in very many of the grant applications that many of us have to fill out, that many granting organizations still ask for the principal investigator. And they ask who your local collaborators are. And that question is really jarring, considering what Indigenous people have done and what local people have continued to do to shape African conservation on this continent. And it really brings into focus the fact that now, when we were disenfranchised and separated from nature, the question that we were then asked is, or not the question, what we were given was somebody to come and help, somebody to come in and tell us what needs to happen. And this is where saviorism in many ways came in, where heroism came in, that there was going to be an intrepid explorer who was going to save the day. And it was the beginnings of parachute science, which is a huge topic, which I think I'm hoping that after we're done with this, Shivani will weigh in on and really talk about how detrimental parachute science has been. Then I want to talk about privilege. So we've covered some of the things that the racial microaggression has done. Yes, thank you, Melissa. Parachute science and parachute conservation. I want to speak very briefly about privilege as well. And I'll speak briefly, and again, I'm going to be inviting Colleen Begg, who she and I have had this conversation many times. She and Shivani and all of the members of the Pride Lion Conservation Alliance have been such great friends in helping to frame a lot of these things. So I really want Colleen to speak a little bit more about privilege. But my part of speaking about privilege is going to be about myself and the fact that my best way is to understand that everybody has some form of it and some just have more than others. So I think that each and every person needs to do the work of identifying where their privilege might lie. And I'm still doing this work every single day. I have a lot of privilege. I am the child of two academics. My father was a university professor and possibly the first Maasai to go to Oxford. My mother, for 25 years, worked as a publicity manager at Oxford University Press. And together, these two people shaped so much of my reality and taught me how to think and created a world in which I felt empowered to exist. As I've, continued on my existence journey, I ran an internship program a few years ago, and that program used to have a lot of international students coming through to work on research. And one of the things that I decided that I wanted to do with my privilege was to make sure that we were going to have both local and international students going into this internship program. Great, can pat myself on the back for using privilege well. However, I was obsessed with competence. I was obsessed with the idea that people had to do a certain thing in a certain way, and they had, and the local interns had to match the internationals. And so I was ruthless in making sure that the English was perfect, or the various things were perfect. And did you have this experience? And did you do this other thing? And so I would cut out so many different people. And what that generally did when I look back is I look at the group of interns that I selected, and I realized that I selected people who looked just like me. People whose first language was English, people who'd had experience before they came, people who ideally needed so much more, I'd push aside. And that was exclusion. So each of us have a role to play when it comes to using our privilege, or else you will make a world that generally just looks exactly like you. And what that also does is it creates some spaces that some people are going to be able to access with ease, because of course, I'm not going to ask too many questions of the person who looks like me, but I'm going to make the other person jump through so many hoops to get that same thing. And in the conservation world, what that means, especially in a world that has had a lot of non-locals, white leaders, is that if we're perpetually looking for people who look like us, then you will never have a clear and good succession to make sure that African conservation then ends up in local hands. Why does this all matter? I think I've started to answer that question, but I do this, and the reason why I am so passionate about this topic is because of the human cost of race, power, and privilege in conservation in Africa. It's so very important to look at that human cost, and to look at the fact that so many people then don't benefit, and then so many people feel disengaged. And if they feel disengaged, then who is going to be the stewards of nature? I'd like to also pause and look at power. And at this point, I would like to just ask my donors, please, please continue to give money to Ewaso Lions. We need money. But I'm going to touch on something that is really important when it comes to power, which is funding and the power of funding. Funding creates a really asymmetric world. For a very long time, of course, money has flowed from the global north to the global south. It just is how it is. But it creates an imbalance sometimes, because the agenda is not always set in the places where the people know what is needed. I've had friends tell me that they entered a certain institution because they wanted to study soil, but there was no money for soil studies. There was money for rhino work. There are people who needed capacity support or salaries, but there was no money for that. There was money for a new ranger unit. And the media plays a really huge role in shaping what people with power think is needed. So the question around this is, who sets the agenda? who is the conservation for? Who is that conservation for? And is that necessary? Many of the people I'm speaking to today have a lot of power. And that power is not a bad thing. In fact, to be honest, as I scroll through the list of the people who are here, who I know are such amazing supporters of Ewaso Lions and of the Wildlife Conservation Network, I've never felt happier with the people in power, because the people who support us do two things, which is, one, they listen actively and they trust us to do what we know is going to be important. And they also ask the most important question, which is, what do you need? So these are some of the really important things around power. And if you flip what then happens and why it matters, what the human cost is if that doesn't happen correctly. One of the most detrimental things is the one face model. And again, I'm going to invite Shivani. She'll talk about parachute science and the one face model, and how painful that model has been, this idea of the intrepid hero that so many people look up to or look for in conservation organizations to forever be that light. There's also the language of disempowerment. This is still on why does this matter? That we continue to have this pervasive image of the language of disempowerment. I received a slide today, which was very, very interesting. I hope that you'll be able to see it. This is the power of language and how we see the other. You can see that there is absolutely no difference between the left side of your screen and the right side of your screen, save the color of the flags. But on one side, you have our blessed homeland, and on the other side, you have their barbarous waste. On one side, you have our great religion, and the other side, you have their primitive superstition. And I think the power of language has shaped how conservation is done, and how, if not from the beginning of conservation as we know it, or as it has been defined for us since the turn of the 20th century. There are hunters and there are poachers. But I think more critically, there are conservationists who, those who have studied very highly and have come to do a project are conservationists, whereas those who have kept their lands open and whose cultures actually define those landscapes and allow wildlife to live there, who tolerate it when a lion eats their camel, are called the local community. And the prevailing structures continue, if the prevailing structures as well continue to exist that promote this language, then no matter who we put at the top of this, no matter which leader who looks right apparently goes to the top, we will never have a different sort of conservation. We discussed those prevailing structures quite at length. I had a great conversation with Judy Kefagona about a year ago, and we'll share the link about that. So I won't go too deeply into that. But I'd like to now discuss some of the ways forward. And this is the part that is really very close to my heart and heartens me a lot about this. We began a program in Ewaso Lions about a year ago called Beyond Boundaries KE. And this program is about telling stories. It's about decolonizing and changing this narrative and making sure that everybody. We do this by symposia. And we held a symposium in 2019. We held a symposium in 2019 and another in 2020, and we're going to hold another one hopefully in the next few, before the year is up, that will be really locally focused. And these symposia are to really involve students in helping to craft this space. And this is really important because it gets students to not be overly naive as they walk into conservation and not believe that everything is just great, but also not to be overly suspicious, because I think the prevailing conditions in Kenya is that you are kind of one or the other. There are people who really have used the word conservation and they use it with a C-O-N, capital C-O-N, that this is all a con, that none of it is real and that none of it is useful. And I think both those are quite dangerous for students. They need to keep their minds open to learn, but also to question and also to shape. And so we've engaged a lot of students through this. We also do quite a lot of storytelling. I love this image because I've seen it used in so many different ways. We use it as the image of coexistence. You can see there are people with their goats in the background. There are some other ungulates in that background. And then there's this elephant in the foreground. And for us, that is coexistence. And we're telling the stories of this coexistence in all sorts of ways. We still haven't gotten that formula right. So if you have ideas of how we can tell the stories and really help Kenyans reclaim their place, Africans reclaim their knowledge, that would be really wonderful. And we also do it through dialogue, things that I can say even today we are doing Beyond Boundaries KE, because dialogue is at the heart of this discussion. It's at the heart of what we want to achieve, because dialogue then brings us closer together rather than splitting us apart. And we always really believe that this must be done in the power of partnership and collaboration. So we have had conversations called Changing the Conservation Narrative between Shivani, Sarah Childs, and myself. And we talk about all of these issues and we invite people to talk with us. We had a panel discussion on this very topic. And that same time, I met with these incredible women in the Pathways Conference on Human Dimensions. And we realized that there's so many microaggressions that have plagued so many of us. And so much hurt has happened. So we wrote an article. As with this discussion and every other discussion, I really believe that we have to do it with the view to create a road to recovery. So we wanted people to see themselves in our stories. We wanted people to question where they have been and what they have done and their actions rather than who they are. This wasn't about the color of their skin, but things that maybe they've done that have been detrimental, or things that they could have done better. And our program has achieved quite a bit. We had probably the first discussion about, race and power and privilege in Kenya last year. We've engaged over 400 students, and that article was viewed over 30,000 times and made it into being required reading in some institutions. So my question as I close is, what would the world be like if it were different and if we got this right? I think this world would be really inclusive. This conservation world would be truly inclusive. Can't continue to survive as wildlife conservation by itself, because for us in northern Kenya, it is the culture of pastoralism that has helped that wildlife to continue to survive. So conservation has to include our cultures, our stories, us. It has to include our lands and our landscapes and that wildlife, and how to bring all those things together. And I think at the end of it, it also means that every single person can belong, wherever you are contributing to this conservation story, that you feel that you can play a part, and that, you know what, you can also make mistakes, but you can learn from those mistakes and be able to be in a vulnerable space about this, and no faking, no tokenism, none of these farcical things that are happening right now for people who want to stay within the buzzwords of say inclusion or all of those things, inclusion and decolonization and equity and all of these things, that they would really mean things to us, because this is a question of justice and it must therefore mean something to us. I would like to close a poem that encapsulates this, and this poem is called The Circle, and it's by Mercy Amba Odioye. And she says, "A circle expands forever. It covers all who wish to hold hands, and its size depends on each other. It is a vision of solidarity. It turns outward to interact with the outside and inward for self-critique. A circle expands forever. It is the vision of accountability. It grows as the other is moved to grow. A circle must have a center, but a single dot does not make a circle. A tree does not make a forest. A circle, a vision of cooperation, mutuality, and care. That is the sort of conservation that I want to see. That is the sort of new conservation narrative that really acknowledges these issues around race and power and privilege, that I think hopefully will make a schema for us to build a new reality, a better reality, one that doesn't have a high human cost or a cost to nature, one that acknowledges everybody. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to invite Shivani and Colleen up as well. Oh, great. Okay.
Go ahead, Resson.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really would like to thank Colleen and Leela as the founders of We Africa for helping me create a schema and a frame for many of the things that I'm very passionate about, as you can tell. Please feel free to talk to us and tell us what you think in the comments, and we're going to have you as well on the screen in a little bit. But maybe, Colleen, you can speak a little bit more about privilege, and just the discussions that we've always had.
Isn't it astonishing? Can you hear me, by the way, first of all?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So isn't it astonishing that I've had these conversations with you so many times? It's still hard. And I guess the first thing I wanted to say is, as I was listening to you, Resson, first of all, I learned a lot. I always learn a lot listening to you. And secondly, it occurred to me that it's a bit like when you speak a new language. How embarrassed you get when you first start speaking a language. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
People laugh at you. People find it very funny that you're doing it. Sometimes you offend people because you're massacring their language. And so I often feel like trying to do this right and trying to be inclusive is a journey, and it's very much about learning a new language. And the more you become aware of it, the more that you have trust with other people that point out your mistakes, the easier it gets and the better you get at recognizing your own privilege. So the one thing about privilege is it's really hard to see it and in yourself. And so as a white South African, as an African, I consider myself an African, but I certainly have a massive amount of privilege that I need people I trust to call me out on it when I'm doing things that are biased or that I'm just completely unaware of. And the system in conservation has been constructed in a way that perpetuates the privilege. I even see government officials doing it, where there'll be a meeting with our conservation director, Agostino, there, And the government official will say, well, where's the director? And he'll say, well, I'm here. And what they really mean is, where's the white person? And these are national Black African conservationists or guys that we are going to have to be very intentional about changing the way conservation is done. And it's going to require not only the huge courage you have, Resson, but it's going to require the white Africans and white conservationists to actually speak out about it and be very clear about what we are going to try and do, because we are the ones with the privilege. And so we have to open the way and we have to call other people out on it. It would be sometimes very difficult for you to do, Resson, and sometimes very difficult for our team to do. And that I have to take on as a responsibility to call other people out on it, just as I would call them out on chauvinism as well, or any of the other isms, actually, is you have to stand your ground and call out on it. And so I guess I didn't want to say too much other than it's a journey. And it's wonderful to have friends like you two, as well as all the We Africa fellows and sisters, because these safe spaces, and everybody here actually, and these safe spaces are critically important so that we stop being nervous about this conversation in conservation. And we eventually reach critical mass where we basically just outnumber everybody and then we start doing it the way it should be done. Because if we keep doing conservation from one cultural worldview, we're going to lose it all. I'm absolutely convinced of it, that we will lose everything if we don't start opening up and being more inclusive and recognizing that there are a whole lot of different ideas out there that are going to help us do conservation properly. But yeah, that's my 2 cents worth for today.
Always so extremely succinct and just like hit all the nails on the head. And Shivani, I think maybe you could also talk a little bit about this one face model, this thing that we talk about and we just get so.
Before I do that, I just want to say, Resson, I know you were so nervous today, but you're such an inspiration. These are such difficult conversations to have. And the fact that you're doing this out there in the open is just amazing. You are truly an inspiration. So yeah, bravo, Resson. My bit's very little. I don't want to talk too much because I want everyone to come into the booth. The one face model and parachute science, I think, are quite closely linked. And for so long, growing up here in Kenya and watching documentaries or reading books about who was working in conservation, I had a very different image back then to what I've learned now. The books that I was obsessed with were written by people not from that country. They had come in from the outside. They had done some work, whether it was a PhD or a small conservation project, and they had left. And they had done no capacity building. They had done no investment into the local communities that they were working with. And it was only in the last, I'd say, 5 years, I realized, well, probably a bit longer, between 5 to 10 years, I realized that this is actually a huge problem, and it's actually got a term, parachute science, something I'd never heard of before. I'd never heard those 2 words. But a good friend of ours, Asha DeVos, she runs a whale project in Sri Lanka, and she talks about this so much. And I remember sitting with her in the bus one day at the WCN Expo, and she started talking about it, and I thought, yes, this is what has bothered me for so long. This whole, why are people coming in and telling us what to do in our country to protect our wildlife with so little investment in our own country? And so this concept of parachute science has been something Resson and I are talking a lot about now, because it's got to change. We have got to start talking about it, because only then will it change. And this now leads to the whole one face model. When I started Ewaso Lions, I remember someone came up to me, actually a few people came up to me and said, Shivani, you're going to have to get very used to being the face of Ewaso Lions, because that's what conservation projects are like. They're run by this one person, that person's the face, and that person is sort of the image that'll go on forever. And I would squirm every time I'd get that focus. I would squirm every time there was a spotlight on me. I would squirm when I'd get an award and it was for me and not my team. And again, when I got that dreadful advice, I pushed back and I said, this makes me really uncomfortable. And just because it apparently is the way things are done, that's no reason for us not to try and change it. And we have worked so hard in the last decade to make this about our teams. Look at Colleen and her amazing team. Look at our extraordinary team here in Northern Kenya and in Nairobi. This is about our team. This is not about Shivani. And the pressure that was being put on me, that I had to be the one the media wanted to talk to. I had to be the one the journalists wanted to talk to. We even have some donors of ours who would say, no, I'd rather talk to Shivani and not Resson, because Resson's in Nairobi and Shivani's in Samburu. That is so insulting and so unfair. Resson is an absolute equal in this team. Just because she lives in Nairobi doesn't mean that she is not an equal member of this team. And we have faced this so much, and it's got to change. It is not sustainable to have all that pressure on one person. I don't want to be in my 80s and 90s talking about Ewaso Lions. I want my team to drive this forward, which is exactly what they are doing. And when I do see some leaders out there still speaking about their project, themselves, their species, I really wonder, what kind of leader are you? To me, you're not a good leader. So that is something that, as you can tell, really bothers me about this one-face model. We're working so hard to try and change it, but it requires so many conversations and it requires change. And just looking at these two amazing women in front of me, Resson and Colleen, that gives me so much hope that we can change it and we can move in the right direction. So